At 0540 on the morning of October 1944, Ensign Robert Bobby Malone gripped the throttle of his TBF Avenger torpedo bomber and stared through the rain-smeared windshield at the dark shape of the carrier USS Intrepid disappearing behind him. The sea below was slate gray and churning. The sky ahead was the color of a bruise. He was 22 years old, and he had never dropped a torpedo in anger. His target, according to the mission brief, was a column of Japanese warships threading through the Sibuyan Sea in the Philippines. The intelligence officers had described the force in calm, clinical language. Heavy cruisers, destroyers, the battleship Yamato. They had not described what it would look like from 500 feet, coming in low over the water with every anti-aircraft gun on a fleet of warships pointed directly at you. That part nobody had described. If you've never heard of torpedo bomber crews and what they were asked to do over the Pacific, stay with this video. Because what these young men flew into on a near-daily basis during the Second World War was not combat in any conventional sense. It was something closer to a mathematical problem where the variable being solved for was survival, and the odds were rarely in their favor. The torpedo attack run was, in the purest and most brutal terms, one of the most dangerous single acts a military aviator could be ordered to perform in the entire war. To understand why, you have to understand what an aerial torpedo actually required of the men delivering it. The Mark 13 aerial torpedo, the standard weapon carried by American TBF Avenger crews throughout the Pacific campaign, weighed just over 2,200 pounds fully armed. It was a self-propelled underwater weapon, driven by a gyroscopic guidance system and a combustion engine, designed to detonate against the hull of a ship below the waterline where the damage would be most catastrophic. But it was a deeply unforgiving weapon to deliver. The torpedo had to be released within a narrow set of parameters or it would simply fail. The releasing aircraft had to be flying at between 150 and 200 knots. No faster, no slower. The aircraft had to be at an altitude of between 50 and 200 feet above the sea surface. Any higher and the torpedo would break apart on impact with the water. Any lower and there was simply no room to survive the pullout. The aircraft had to be flying in an essentially straight and level line on approach, holding course for the final run-in. And the release point had to be within roughly 800 to 1,000 yards of the target ship. 800 yards, less than half a mile, from a ship whose entire defensive armament, every gun, every barrel, every gunner was pointed directly at you. The Japanese had spent years studying American attack patterns. By 1943, their fleet anti-aircraft batteries had been specifically reorganized around the problem of defeating torpedo bomber attacks. Light cruisers and destroyers in Japanese formations were positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire against low-altitude threats. Larger warships carried batteries of 25mm anti-aircraft guns, sometimes over 100 barrels on a single vessel, specifically for close-range defense. The gunners had range tables calibrated for the exact speed and altitude of an attacking Avenger. They knew the approach vector. They knew the release parameters. They knew, in other words, exactly where the American aircraft had to be, for how long, flying in what direction. And they were ready. The men who flew these missions knew all of this. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about torpedo bomber crews in the Pacific. They were not ignorant of the danger. They had been trained to understand it, briefed to expect it, and ordered to accept it. Second Lieutenant Thomas Alvarez of Corpus Christi, Texas, was a TBF Avenger pilot with Torpedo Squadron 6, based aboard USS Enterprise during the critical campaigns of 1943 and 1944. He had grown up on the Gulf Coast, the son of a commercial fisherman, and had learned to navigate by reading water and weather before he had ever seen the inside of a cockpit. He joined the Navy in January 1942, 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor, motivated, like hundreds of thousands of young Americans in those weeks, by a mixture of grief, fury, and the straightforward belief that the war had to be fought. His training took 18 months. Torpedo School at Naval Air Station Norfolk. Advanced Carrier Qualifications at Glenview, Illinois. Tactical exercises in the Gulf of Mexico where instructors flew simulated intercept runs against the students, trying to shake them, trying to replicate the chaos of a defended approach. The instructors were honest with their students in ways that, in retrospect, seem almost compassionate in their bluntness. One instructor at Norfolk, a veteran of the Battle of Midway who had watched 3/4 of Torpedo Squadron 8 die in a single morning, told Alvarez's class something that Alvarez later recorded in a letter to his mother. He wrote it down almost verbatim, the way young men write down things they know they need to remember. The instructor had said, "Boys, if you pull off your run and you're still breathing, count yourself lucky and get back to the ship, because what you're going to fly into out there has killed better pilots than any of you." Nobody argued with him. At Midway in June 1942, that instructor's assessment had been validated in the most terrible way imaginable. Torpedo Squadron 8, flying obsolete Douglas Devastator aircraft from the carrier USS Hornet, had launched 41 aircraft against the Japanese fleet. 35 men were killed. No torpedo hit the Japanese fleet. Not one. The aircraft were too slow, the approach too predictable, the defensive fire too overwhelming. The surviving pilot, Ensign George Gay, was pulled from the water after watching his entire squadron destroyed around him. He described holding onto a seat cushion in the middle of the Japanese fleet, watching Japanese aircraft being destroyed by American dive bombers overhead, and being physically unable to process the scale of what had just happened. The Devastator torpedo bomber was retired almost immediately after Midway. It had been designed in the early 1930s, and by 1942 it simply could not survive a defended approach against a modern fleet. Its maximum speed of approximately 180 miles per hour was barely adequate to deliver a torpedo under ideal conditions and nowhere near fast enough to minimize the exposure time over the target. The Navy replaced it with the Grumman TBF Avenger, a substantially larger and more capable aircraft, and began the long, painful process of developing tactics that might give torpedo bomber crews a genuine chance of survival. But the Avenger's improvements, while real, could not solve the fundamental mathematical problem of the torpedo attack run. You still had to fly straight and level at low altitude within 1,000 yards of a ship that was trying to kill you. The airplane was faster. The crew was 3 instead of 2. The aircraft carried armor plating around the pilot and radio gunner. The self-sealing fuel tanks reduced the risk of catastrophic fire from the first hit. The turret-mounted 50 caliber machine gun gave the crew something to shoot back with. But none of that changed the basic geometry of what was being asked of them. The carrier battles of 1942 and 1943 were the crucible in which American naval aviation was remade under fire. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, at Midway in June, at the Eastern Solomons in August, at Santa Cruz in October. Each engagement cost the Navy pilots and aircrews an aircraft that could not easily be replaced. Each engagement also produced lessons, hard, blood-bought lessons about what worked and what didn't. The tactical conclusion that emerged from these battles was clear and somewhat grim. Torpedo attacks, to have any chance of success against a defended fleet, had to be coordinated. Dive bombers and torpedo bombers had to arrive over the target simultaneously, from different directions, splitting the defensive fire and forcing Japanese gun crews to choose between threats. Fighters had to suppress anti-aircraft positions, or at least force gunners to split their attention. Timing had to be near perfect. In practice, achieving this coordination was extraordinarily difficult. Radio communications were unreliable at range. Aircraft from different squadrons flew at different speeds and different altitudes. Weather disrupted formations. Navigation over open ocean with limited instruments and no landmarks was imprecise. And the Japanese fleet, needless to say, was not cooperating by holding still. The result was that torpedo bombers frequently arrived over their targets alone, or with inadequate fighter escort, or without the simultaneous dive bomber attack that was supposed to divide the defensive fire. When that happened, the survival rates for torpedo crews dropped sharply. Thomas Alvarez flew his first combat mission in February 1943 during operations in the Solomon Islands, part of the sustained American effort to isolate and neutralize the Japanese base at Rabaul. His first target was a Japanese supply convoy attempting to reinforce their garrisons on Bougainville. He described the approach in a letter written that same evening, a letter that somehow combined meticulous tactical observation with the flat, almost numbed language of a young man who is still processing what he has just been through. He wrote, "We came in at about 150 feet. You could see everything clearly from that height. The ships, the wakes, the gun flashes. The shells were going past us like orange lines. I dropped at about 800 yards and pulled hard right and went as low as I could go without hitting the water. I don't know how long it took to get clear. It felt like a long time. He did not mention whether the torpedo hit. It hadn't, but he had come back. By the summer of 1943, Alvarez had flown 11 torpedo attack missions. He had lost 2 wingmen and 3 close friends from his squadron. He had been hit by anti-aircraft fire on 4 separate occasions, twice badly enough to require emergency repairs before his aircraft was flyable again. He had watched a torpedo aircraft from his own formation take a direct hit from a Japanese 5-inch gun at close range and simply disintegrate. And he had kept flying. The psychological dimension of this kind of combat, repeated, high-intensity, high-mortality exposure over months, is something that the official mission records and after-action reports don't capture. The reports document aircraft lost, torpedoes expended, damage assessments. They don't document what it cost the surviving crews to walk back to the ready room after a mission, to sit down in those leather chairs surrounded by empty seats, to eat dinner with men who had been alive at breakfast and were now in the ocean somewhere southeast of Bougainville. The Navy had no formal program for managing combat stress in 1943. Crews were rotated after a certain number of missions, in theory. In practice, the demands of the campaign meant that experienced crews were often kept in the fight longer than rotation schedules allowed, because there were not yet enough trained replacements to take their places. Alvarez was aware, in the way that combat veterans become aware of these things, that he was being changed by what he was experiencing. He wrote to his mother in April 1943, "I sleep all right most nights. Some nights I don't. You start thinking about the ones who didn't make it back and you wonder about the difference between them and you, and there isn't really any difference you can point to. It's just the way it went." That sentence, "there isn't really any difference you can point to," captures something essential about the experience of combat aviation that statistics and after-action reports cannot convey. The randomness of survival in torpedo bombing was not a bug in the system. It was the system. The margins were too thin, the defensive fire too dense, the variables too numerous for individual skill or courage to reliably separate the living from the dead. Good pilots died. Careful pilots died. Experienced pilots with dozens of combat hours died on missions that less experienced men survived by pure chance. The torpedo attack run punished and rewarded with a randomness that was, over time, psychologically corrosive in ways that even the men themselves did not always recognize until long after the war. This story has been forgotten by most. If you want to make sure more histories like this one reach the people who need to hear them, hit subscribe right now. It takes 2 seconds and it means the world to the work we're doing here. The physical geography of the Pacific Campaign shaped the air war in ways that had no equivalent in Europe. In Normandy, as you've heard in other episodes on this channel, P-47 Thunderbolt pilots operating from forward airfields in France could fly combat missions, return to base, rearm and refuel, and fly again in the same afternoon. The distances were manageable. The logistics, while difficult, operated on a human scale. In the Pacific, everything was different. The ocean was enormous. Island bases were separated by hundreds of miles of open water. Carrier aviation was not an option for reaching certain targets. It was the only option. And carrier-based torpedo bombing meant that the men launching these attacks had nowhere to divert if their aircraft were damaged. They had to get back to the carrier or they went into the ocean. This created a specific and terrible kind of stress that ground attack pilots in Europe did not face in quite the same way. A P-47 pilot hit by Flak over France could sometimes nurse his aircraft toward Allied lines, bail out over friendly territory, or make an emergency landing at a forward airfield. A TBF Avenger pilot with a damaged engine, 300 miles from the nearest carrier, over open ocean, had no such options. The carrier itself, of course, was also moving. Navigation back to a ship that might have changed course and speed during the hours you'd been gone, over featureless ocean, with a potentially damaged aircraft and limited fuel, was its own distinct challenge. Men who survived the torpedo run sometimes did not survive the return trip. By late 1944, the tactical situation in the Pacific had shifted significantly from the desperate defensive battles of 1942. American industrial production, which had seemed almost abstract in the early months of the war, had become devastatingly concrete. New carriers were arriving in the Pacific in numbers that strained the Japanese ability to track them, let alone counter them. New aircraft, faster, better armed, more durable, were replacing the types that had fought the early battles. But the torpedo attack run remained what it had always been. A low-altitude, straight and level approach toward a defended ship, flown by men who understood exactly what was waiting for them, and who climbed into their aircraft anyway. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 was the largest naval battle in history by almost every measure. It involved over 200 Allied ships and approximately 67 Japanese vessels across multiple separate engagements spread across thousands of square miles of ocean. Its outcome determined whether the American liberation of the Philippines would proceed or whether a Japanese surface force would break through to devastate the vulnerable invasion transports at Leyte. It was here, in the sequence of engagements that historians would later call the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea, that some of the most intense and costly torpedo bombing attacks of the entire Pacific War took place. And it was here that Thomas Alvarez, by then a seasoned veteran with over 30 combat missions, flew what he would later describe simply as the worst day of his life. The Japanese Center Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, was one of the most powerful surface action groups ever assembled. It included the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, the largest battleships ever built, each displacing over 70,000 tons and protected by armor plating 18 inches thick at the turret faces. Alongside them were 3 older battleships, 12 cruisers, and 15 destroyers. The anti-aircraft armament of this force, concentrated and mutually supporting, represented a density of defensive fire that was almost unprecedented in naval warfare. American carrier aircraft from Task Force 38 made 5 separate attack waves against Kurita's force during October 24, 1944. Alvarez flew in the 3rd wave. His after-action debrief, preserved in the operational records of Carrier Air Wing 6 at the National Archives, is a document that reads like a technical report on the surface and something else entirely if you read it carefully. He documented his approach altitude, his release point, his pull-out heading. He documented the weather conditions, partly cloudy, visibility good, ceiling above 10,000 feet. He documented the defensive fire as intense and accurate from initial point. What the debrief does not capture, but what Alvarez described 40 years later in a recorded interview conducted by the Naval Institute Oral History Program, was the physical reality of flying through that wall of fire. He said, "You're coming in at 150 feet and they've got 5-inch guns, 40mm guns, 25mm guns, and they're all firing at once. The tracers are so thick it looks like you're flying into a rainstorm. Except the raindrops are trying to kill you. You lock your eyes on the target and you fly the airplane and you try not to think about what's happening around you because if you start thinking about it, you'll flinch, and if you flinch you won't get the torpedo off properly and the whole thing will have been for nothing." If this video is adding to your understanding of what the men of the Pacific War actually endured, please take a moment to like it. It helps us keep building this archive of stories that deserve to be told. The Musashi, one of the 2 great super battleships of the Japanese fleet, absorbed an extraordinary amount of punishment during the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea. Over the course of the 5 attack waves on October 24th, she was struck by approximately 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs. She sank late that afternoon, taking over 1,000 of her crew with her. The Yamato was also hit, twice by torpedo, but survived the battle and continued with the fleet. The cost to the American strike aircraft was severe. Across all 5 waves of attacks, 18 American aircraft were lost over the Sibuyan Sea. Dozens more returned to their carriers damaged. Torpedo bomber crews, flying the low-level runs against the most heavily defended targets, accounted for a disproportionate share of those losses. Alvarez's aircraft was hit twice on his attack run. The first hit punctured his port wing fuel tank and destroyed his radio equipment. The second hit, a 25mm round that came through the lower fuselage, wounded his turret gunner, Aviation Radioman 2nd Class Edwin Marks of Dayton, Ohio, in the left shoulder. Alvarez dropped his torpedo at approximately 900 yards and pulled out low over the water, heading south away from the Japanese formation. His radio was gone. He had no way to contact the carrier, no way to receive updated navigation information, no way to call for help if his engine failed. He had a wounded man in the turret and fuel that was draining steadily from the punctured tank. He flew south for 40 minutes by dead reckoning, estimating his carrier's position from the last known course and speed information he'd been given before launch, adjusted for elapsed time. When the ship came into sight on the horizon, a small gray shape against the gray sea, he later said he felt something that he could not quite describe as relief, because relief implied that he had been uncertain, and he had not allowed himself to be uncertain. He had simply flown the airplane. Marks was taken to the carrier's sick bay. The wound was serious. The round had fractured his shoulder blade and nicked the subclavian artery, but the ship's surgeons repaired the damage. Marks returned to flight duty 6 weeks later. Alvarez was back in the air the following morning. The rhythm of carrier aviation in the Pacific War was something that civilians at home, reading newspaper accounts of great fleet engagements, rarely understood. The headlines captured the battles: Coral Sea, Midway, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf. They named the ships and the admirals. They reported the tonnage sunk and the aircraft destroyed. What they did not capture was the texture of the days between those battles. The routine, grinding, daily work of keeping aircraft flying, keeping men ready, maintaining the physical and psychological machinery of a carrier air group operating in sustained combat over months at a stretch. Reveille before dawn. Flight quarters. Pre-mission briefings in the ready room where intelligence officers pinned photographs to corkboards and described targets in the flat language of official reports. The walk across the flight deck in darkness. The smell of aviation fuel and salt air. The noise of engines turning over. Then the catapult shot. A violent mechanical acceleration from 0 to flying speed in less than 3 seconds, and the aircraft was airborne, climbing away from the ship into whatever the sky had to offer that morning. On the good days, the target was lightly defended and the approach was straightforward and everyone came back. On the bad days, the flak was thick from the initial point and you lost people and you came back and sat in the ready room and looked at the empty chairs, and the intelligence officers came in to debrief you and you answered their questions and then you went to eat something and tried to sleep for a few hours before the next briefing. Thomas Alvarez flew through both kinds of days, dozens of times, over a period of roughly 14 months of active combat deployment. By the time the war ended in August 1945, he had accumulated 71 combat missions and logged over 800 hours of flight time in the Pacific theater. He had been recommended for the Navy Cross after the Leyte Gulf strikes, receiving the decoration for pressing home his torpedo attack against the Musashi under intense defensive fire with a wounded crew member aboard. He had also lost, by his own careful count, 23 men from his torpedo squadron. Men he had trained with, flown with, eaten with. Men whose last moments he had sometimes witnessed from a distance, watching an aircraft take a hit and go into the water and not come back up. 23 names. He remembered every one. The Japanese anti-aircraft capability that American torpedo crews faced in 1944 was the product of years of painful tactical learning on the Japanese side. After Midway, after the Solomon Islands campaigns, after the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, a battle the Americans called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot because of the catastrophic losses suffered by Japanese carrier aviation, the Imperial Japanese Navy had fundamentally reorganized how its surface ships defended themselves against air attack. The 25mm Type 96 anti-aircraft gun was the primary close-range defensive weapon of the Japanese fleet. It was a light autocannon, firing shells roughly the diameter of a man's thumb at a cyclic rate of approximately 220 rounds per minute from a 3-round magazine feed. A Japanese destroyer might carry 8 to 12 of these weapons in single, twin, and triple mount configurations. A heavy cruiser might carry 30 or 40 barrels. The super battleships Yamato and Musashi, as they were configured by late 1944, carried an almost incomprehensible 152 25mm barrels between them, along with numerous 40mm and 5-inch guns. The tactical doctrine that governed how these weapons were used against torpedo bombers had been refined through combat experience. Gun directors tracked incoming aircraft from the moment they were spotted. Fire was coordinated to create overlapping zones of coverage at the altitudes and ranges where torpedo aircraft had to fly to deliver their weapons. The mathematics of the torpedo attack, the speed, the altitude, the approach angle were known quantities, which meant that Japanese gun crews could calculate with reasonable accuracy where an attacking aircraft had to be at the moment of release and concentrate their fire accordingly. This is what made the torpedo run fundamentally different from other forms of air attack. A dive bomber approaching from 15,000 feet had multiple possible release points and pull-out headings. A fighter pilot had 3 dimensions of maneuver available to him. But a torpedo pilot, in the final 800 yards of his run, had essentially none. He had to be at that altitude, at that speed, on that heading. The Japanese gunners knew it. The American pilots knew that the Japanese gunners knew it. And they flew in anyway. The survival statistics for American torpedo bomber crews in the Pacific War reflect this reality with cold precision. Across the major fleet engagements of 1942 through 1945, the loss rate for torpedo aircraft on heavily defended attack runs consistently exceeded that of any other American aircraft type. At Midway, as noted, the loss rate for Torpedo Squadron 8 was catastrophic, over 80% killed in a single mission. Even as tactics improved and aircraft quality increased, the fundamental attrition rate for torpedo crews remained higher than for dive bombers or fighters. The Navy's own post-war operational analysis, conducted in 1946 and 1947 by the Strategic Bombing Survey's Naval Division, found that torpedo attacks, while frequently decisive when they succeeded, were achieved at a cost in aircrews and aircraft that was disproportionate to any other form of carrier strike. The analysis recommended substantial investment in developing standoff weapons that could be launched from outside effective anti-aircraft range, a recommendation that shaped naval aviation development for decades. But in 1944, standoff weapons did not yet exist in effective form. The men of the torpedo squadrons had what they had: a large, relatively slow aircraft, a 2,000-pound torpedo with strict delivery parameters, and the training and discipline to fly a straight course at 50 feet when every survival instinct in the human nervous system was screaming at them to break away. The willingness to override that instinct mission after mission, month after month, is something that does not fit neatly into the language of heroism that surrounds Second World War aviation. Heroism implies a singular moment of decision, a choice made once under extreme pressure. What torpedo bomber crews were asked to do was different. They were asked to make that choice repeatedly, in cold blood, knowing exactly what was waiting for them, with full awareness of what had happened to the men who had flown the same runs before them. Edwin Marks, Alvarez's turret gunner, returned to flight duty in late November 1944, as Alvarez noted. He was 20 years old. In a letter to his parents in Dayton that has been preserved by his family and excerpted in a privately published memoir compiled by his children in 2003, Marks wrote something that captures the psychological reality of torpedo bombing more precisely than any official document. He wrote, "You get to the point where you stop thinking about whether you're going to get hit, because if you think about it, you can't do the job. So you just stop thinking about it. You think about the target. You think about your release point. You think about doing your job right. And then afterwards, when it's over, you let yourself think about what just happened. But not during. That deliberate, trained suppression of self-preservation instinct, the conscious decision to redirect attention from the incoming fire to the mechanics of the job, was something that torpedo crews described in strikingly similar terms, across different squadrons, different carriers, different years of the war. It was not exactly bravery in the conventional sense. It was something more methodical, a professional discipline applied to an activity that was, in the most literal terms, potentially fatal. The training that produced this discipline had been refined over the course of the war with the same painful iterative process that characterized American military adaptation throughout the conflict. The early training programs of 1941 and 1942 had focused heavily on the technical mechanics of torpedo delivery and relatively little on the psychological preparation required to execute those mechanics under fire. As casualty rates from the early fleet engagements came in, training programs were revised. By 1943, torpedo school at Naval Air Station Norfolk and at the dedicated training facilities in Hawaii included simulated anti-aircraft fire, using flare guns and smoke generators to create a visual representation of defensive fire density. Instructors who had flown combat missions described in explicit detail what pilots would experience on a defended run. Psychological preparation became a formal element of the curriculum. The men who graduated from these revised programs were not fearless. Fear was present and acknowledged. The training was designed to ensure that fear did not prevent effective action, that pilots and crew members could perform their technical tasks correctly even when the threat environment was at its worst. The distinction between fearlessness and trained functionality under fear is subtle but important. Fearlessness might produce recklessness. Trained functionality produced accuracy, and accuracy mattered enormously. A torpedo released at the wrong speed, the wrong altitude, the wrong range would not hit. Given the cost of getting to the release point in the first place, the aircraft damaged, the crews wounded or killed on the approach. A miss was not simply a tactical failure. It was a waste of everything that had been spent to get there. The Musashi's sinking on October 24, 1944, was the result of that accumulated accuracy applied across 5 strike waves over the course of a full day. She was the most heavily armored, most heavily armed, most comprehensively defended vessel in the Japanese fleet. She displaced nearly 73,000 tons when fully loaded. Her main belt armor was 16 inches of hardened steel. Her anti-aircraft battery, by the time of Leyte Gulf, comprised over 130 guns of various calibers. She was, on paper, nearly unsinkable. She went to the bottom of the Sibuyan Sea at 1936 hours on October 24, after absorbing a total of approximately 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits over the course of the day's attacks. The torpedo hits were decisive. Bombs damaged her superstructure and started fires and killed men on her upper decks, but it was the torpedoes that flooded her engineering spaces, destroyed her damage control capability, and eventually overwhelmed her ability to maintain buoyancy. Each of those torpedo hits represented a crew that had flown a straight and level approach into the mass defensive fire of one of the most formidable anti-aircraft platforms ever built, held their course, released their weapon at the correct range and altitude, and pulled out. Not all of them had survived to see the result. The operational analysis of the Sibuyan Sea action, compiled in the months after Leyte Gulf, identified a pattern that had emerged consistently across the Pacific campaign. Torpedo attacks delivered by well-trained, disciplined crews, properly coordinated with dive bomber attacks to split defensive fire, achieved hit rates that justified the cost. Attacks delivered piecemeal, without coordination, against targets with undivided defensive capability, were substantially less effective and substantially more costly. This analysis, while tactically sound, contained within it an implicit acknowledgement that was never quite stated directly in the official documents. The coordination that made torpedo attacks effective, the simultaneous arrival of dive bombers and torpedo aircraft over a target, from different directions at carefully timed intervals, was extraordinarily difficult to achieve in practice. And when it failed, when the coordination broke down and torpedo aircraft arrived alone over a defended target, the men flying those aircraft paid the price. Thomas Alvarez was aware of this tension. He had experienced both kinds of missions: the well-coordinated strikes where defensive fire was genuinely split and the approach, while still terrifying, was survivable, and the poorly coordinated missions where he arrived over a target with full defensive attention focused on his single aircraft. The difference was palpable and not merely statistical. In the poorly coordinated missions, the defensive fire was denser, more accurate, more sustained. It had to be survived for longer because there was nothing else for the gunners to worry about. The approach felt, he said later, like being the only person in a room full of armed men who were all watching you. The Battle of Leyte Gulf did not end the torpedo bombing campaign in the Pacific. The war continued for another 10 months after October 1944. American forces moved through the Philippines, approached the Japanese home islands, faced the concentrated resistance of an enemy defending its homeland. Torpedo attacks continued to be flown against Japanese shipping and naval forces wherever they were found. The introduction of the kamikaze, the organized use of aircraft as guided weapons, deliberately crashed into Allied ships by pilots who had accepted their own death as the instrument of the attack, changed the psychological texture of the Pacific War in late 1944 and 1945 in ways that affected everyone who was part of it, including the men of the torpedo squadrons. There was something specifically disturbing, Alvarez said in his later recorded interviews, about facing an enemy who had formally institutionalized the willingness to die as a tactic. American torpedo crews risked death on every mission. They accepted that risk as a condition of the job. But they were not trying to die. The kamikaze pilot was. The asymmetry was difficult to process in human terms, and it added a layer of psychological complexity to the Pacific War's final year that did not have an equivalent in the European theater. By the summer of 1945, American carrier air groups were conducting strikes against targets in the Japanese home islands themselves. Airfields, naval installations, industrial facilities, transportation infrastructure. The missions were long, the targets were defended by whatever anti-aircraft capability Japan could still muster, and the end of the war was close enough to feel within reach but not close enough to make anyone less careful about staying alive. Alvarez flew his last combat mission on August 14, 1945, the day before Japan's Emperor Hirohito announced his country's surrender in a recorded radio broadcast that most Japanese citizens heard for the first time. The mission was a strike against an airfield on Honshu, the main Japanese island. He released his bomb, turned for the carrier, and was on the flight deck when word came over the ship's loudspeakers that the war was over. He sat down on the deck, leaning against the island structure, and, by his own account, did not feel what he had expected to feel. He had expected relief or joy or something large and definitive. What he felt was mostly tired. The men around him were cheering. Some were crying. Others were simply standing quietly, the way men stand when something vast has ended and the scale of it has not yet become fully real. Edwin Marks found him there 20 minutes later and sat down beside him. They didn't say anything for a while. Then Marks said something that Alvarez repeated word for word in his 1989 oral history interview with the Naval Institute. He said, "You think about the ones who didn't make it to today. That was all." Alvarez said yes, and they sat there a while longer while the ship celebrated around them. The final accounting of what American torpedo bombing achieved in the Pacific War is a number that, like all such numbers, tends to flatten the human reality it represents. American carrier-based aircraft sank or seriously damaged hundreds of Japanese vessels over the course of the conflict. Torpedo hits were decisive in the destruction of 4 Japanese fleet carriers at Midway, in the sinking of the super battleship Musashi at Leyte Gulf, in the destruction of the Yamato herself in April 1945 during what Japanese naval planners called a special surface attack mission, a one-way voyage toward Okinawa with fuel for only the outbound trip. The Yamato was struck by approximately 11 torpedoes and 6 bombs during an attack by over 300 American aircraft on April 7, 1945. She capsized and exploded, taking over 3,000 men with her. It was the largest loss of life in the sinking of a single warship in the entire Pacific War. Every torpedo that hit her was delivered by a crew that flew a straight and level approach at low altitude into the defensive fire of a fleet that still, even in the last months of the war, retained enough anti-aircraft capability to kill. 10 American aircraft were lost in the attack. 29 men did not come home. Thomas Alvarez returned to Corpus Christi, Texas, in September 1945. He married Elena Ruiz, a schoolteacher he had met before the war and written to from every carrier anchorage and forward base in the Pacific for 3 years. He went to work for his father-in-law's hardware business. He raised 3 children. He coached Little League Baseball on Saturday mornings for 11 years and said almost nothing about the war to anyone outside his immediate family for nearly 4 decades. He was not unusual in this. The pattern was common among combat veterans of his generation. Not a conspiracy of silence, but something more organic, more personal. The gap between what they had experienced and what civilian life offered in terms of a framework for understanding it was simply too wide to bridge easily in casual conversation. People asked polite questions at dinner parties, and the veterans gave polite answers, and the real story stayed where it was. In 1987, Alvarez's eldest daughter, Maria, convinced him to sit down with a tape recorder and tell the full story. She had done some research of her own, pulling mission records and after-action reports through the National Archives, and she came to those conversations prepared with specific questions. The resulting recordings, 11 hours in total, were donated to the Naval Institute Oral History Program in Washington after Alvarez's death. He died on March 2, 2002, at the age of 79. He was buried with full military honors at the National Cemetery in Corpus Christi. Elena, who had kept every letter he wrote from the Pacific, every single one, donated the correspondence to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, where excerpts have been used in educational exhibitions about Pacific naval aviation. Edwin Marks outlived his pilot by 4 years. He died in 2006 in Dayton, Ohio. His daughter compiled a privately published family memoir that included his Pacific War letters, the shoulder wound report from October 24, 1944, and a photograph of him and Alvarez standing together on the flight deck of USS Enterprise, squinting into the sun, both of them 22 years old and somewhere in the Pacific, and in the photograph they are both smiling. The TBF Avenger itself, the aircraft that carried men like Alvarez and Marks through some of the most intense anti-aircraft fire of the entire war, continued in service long after the conflict ended. Several Allied nations operated Avengers into the 1960s as anti-submarine patrol aircraft. A number survive today in museums and in airworthy condition, appearing at air shows where their large, distinctive silhouette and the deep rumble of their right are 2,800 engine draw crowds who have no particular frame of reference for what those aircraft were asked to do 70 years ago. What the Avengers' post-war career as a crowd-pleasing airshow attraction does not communicate is the specific psychological weight of what it meant to climb into one in 1943 or 1944 and fly toward a defended Japanese fleet. The aircraft looks large and substantial on the ramp. It projects a kind of mechanical confidence. What it cannot project is the experience of sitting in it at 150 feet, with tracers going past the canopy and the release point still 400 yards ahead, and holding the course. The larger lesson of the torpedo bomber campaign in the Pacific, the lesson that military planners and naval theorists drew from it in the decades that followed, is about the relationship between technology, tactics, and human cost in modern warfare. The torpedo bomber was a weapon that worked. When properly employed, when properly coordinated, when delivered by trained crews who could execute their attack profile under extreme conditions, it could sink the largest and most heavily armored vessels ever built. The Musashi, the Yamato, the fleet carriers at Midway, these were not marginal achievements. They were decisive contributions to the outcome of the Pacific War. But the price paid for those achievements, in aircraft lost, in crews killed, in the accumulated psychological damage sustained by the men who flew the missions and survived, was high by any measure. The post-war development of standoff weapons, precision-guided munitions, and eventually anti-ship missiles was driven in significant part by the hard-learned understanding that asking men to fly straight and level through mass defensive fire at low altitude, mission after mission, was a cost that a modern military force could not sustain indefinitely, and perhaps should not ask of its people if alternatives existed. Those alternatives were developed. They exist now, and they work, and the men who fly anti-ship missions today do so from outside the range of the weapons they are attacking, releasing weapons that guide themselves to the target. They still face danger. Modern warfare has not become safe. But they are not asked to hold a straight course at 50 feet through a wall of fire that begins killing them 800 yards from the target and continues until they clear the formation on the other side. That specific form of demanded courage, the cold, trained, professional willingness to suppress every survival instinct and hold a course toward something trying to kill you, not once but dozens of times over months of combat, is what defined the torpedo bomber crews of the Pacific War. It did not make headlines in the way that great naval battles did. The names of the men who flew those missions are not widely remembered. Thomas Alvarez of Corpus Christi, Texas, is not a famous name. Edwin Marks of Dayton, Ohio, is not a famous name. But on October 24, 1944, with radio gone and a wounded man in the turret and fuel draining from a punctured tank, Alvarez held his approach, dropped his torpedo at 900 yards, pulled out low over the water, and flew back to his ship by dead reckoning over 300 miles of open ocean. And the Musashi went to the bottom of the Sibian Sea that evening, and the Japanese center force lost its most powerful warship, and the battle that followed, the battle for Leyte Gulf, the battle that determined the fate of the Philippines, went to the Americans. The connection between those two things, one young man holding his course in one aircraft, and the outcome of the largest naval battle in history, is real, and it is direct, and it is the kind of connection that gets lost in the scale of history unless someone stops to trace it. Thomas Alvarez held his course. 23 of his squadron mates did not make it home. The war ended on a flight deck in the Pacific with 2 men sitting quietly against the island structure while the ship celebrated around them, thinking about the ones who weren't there. That is the story of when a torpedo bomber crew flew into a wall of flak. And it is, in its essential truth, the story of what the Pacific War asked of the young men who fought it. Not the famous ones, not the ones whose names are in the history books, but the ones who climbed into their aircraft every morning and did the job and tried to come back. Most days they did. Some days they didn't. The difference, as Thomas Alvarez wrote to his mother in April 1943, was nothing you could point to. If this story reached something in you, if it matters to you that these men and what they endured are not forgotten, please share this video with someone who would want to know it. And subscribe if you haven't already, because there are hundreds more stories like this one waiting to be told, and every one of them deserves an audience.